I'm Mark Boris, and this is Straight Talk. Can you just take me quickly inside a woman's world, the women's world?
Let's go.
Mia Freedman.
Hello, Mark Boris.
Hello. Welcome to Straight Talk.
Thanks for having me on Straight Talk. I was fascinated always in the news and information and what we would now call content. I used to love magazines. There was no other medium that really at that time spoke to women. The old joke is that Dolly taught you what an orgasm was, Cleo taught you how to have one, Cosmo taught you how to fake one, and the Women's Weekly taught you how to knit one. And then you died. And so it was like we built our communities around these brands. It was really powerful. Part of the reason I left magazines was because I got tired of trying to explain to my bosses that Armageddon was coming in the form of the internet and that we needed to move, we needed to evolve. And they were like, no, we're a magazine company. What we do at Mamamia, I guess, is cover all of those things. We've got 64 different podcasts. We speak to 8 million Australian women every month. Our purpose is to make the world a better place for women and girls.
Look, I'm just looking over at our producer. Mia's starting to interview me.
Yeah.
She can't help it. Mia Freedman.
Hello, Mark Boris.
Hello. Welcome to Straight Talk.
Thanks for having me on Straight Talk.
I love the way you dress. Like, that's so cool. You
you.
get to a stage in your life that being cool is not what everyone else thinks being as cool as you wear what the hell you feel like wearing and just be comfortable.
Exactly. Be comfortable, but for me, it's also sparking joy. So I realized I don't dress for men. I don't dress for women either because I often just dress in a ridiculous way, but it just gives me joy. And if someone hates it, it honestly doesn't affect me and it's not interesting to me what they think. It just sparks joy in me.
Do you know, I don't know if you know this, but I know, and I'm hoping you still love, but I knew your dad in the 90s.
Did you?
Yeah. And I also knew Brian better.
Yeah.
But your dad and Brian Sherman were known as Equity Link twins in those days.
Yeah, they were.
And they were one of the first group to ever go, sort of one of the most prominent groups and first groups to move into the funds management sort of sphere in Australia before it was even known. And I got to meet him through some people who were good mates of mine who were friends of theirs. Actually, they were a Jewish lawyer guy who I used to work for back in the 90s. And that's where I first met your father. Is your father still alive?
He is.
Well done. Perfect. How old is your dad now?
I see him every week. He turned 80 last year.
Wow.
Yeah. And he's still great.
Well, please give him my regards if he remembers me at all. But I was only a young fellow when I did meet him, and I was in a law firm called Simons & Babsky, and that's where I met him back in those days.
Yeah, right.
It makes me feel really ancient, but I'm sitting here in front of someone who's the daughter of somebody I know or the son of somebody I know.
I feel the same way. I had dinner with a girlfriend last night and her daughter is an entrepreneur. You know, her daughter, who I knew when she was a little kid, is an entrepreneur of the sunscreen brand Ultraviolet. And I now interview the children of people I used to know. So I hear you.
It totally
feels interesting.
Weird.
Yeah.
Well, for me, what's worse though is you're a mature woman that are grown. How old are your kids?
27, 18 and 16.
So you got grown kids, pretty much grown.
I've got a grandchild.
You have wow.
Yeah, I'm a grandma. This is my eccentric grandmother era.
I have I have 3 grandsons.
Isn't it the best?
It's so good.
Do you love it?
Yeah, I do. I really love it. Like, I'm actually on a weekend. What's weird? It's amazing. Look, I'm just looking over at our producer. Mia's starting to interview me.
Yeah.
She can't help it. But and I'll tell you why I love it is that on a weekend when I'm thinking, well, what am I going to do? Like I try to chill on weekends, and I just send them a text to all my sons and I say, send me a photograph of the kids.
Yeah.
And they send me a video of the kids doing something stupid, or, I bought them all a punching ball the other day.
How old are the grandkids?
The 2 of them are 2 are 1 year old each. There's 2 weeks between them. And the other one, and George is 7, sorry. And I just love watching their antics.
Yeah. I've got more patience as a grandmother than I probably did as a mum. Like, you can enjoy it more. It's true what they say.
Well, also, you're not as exhausted.
Yeah.
Because, you ever think back, you got 3 kids?
Yeah.
Yeah. When you think back, I have 4 sons. When I think back, I thought, how the hell did I do it?
Were you a hands-on dad?
Yeah, well, yes, in my second marriage with the 3 boys, I was. More so because my wife at the time she was ill for a lot of time, and unfortunately, so I had to do a lot. When I say hands-on, did I go to everything like school, parent and teacher meeting? No, But I was always there, and like in the morning, I had to get them ready for school, and if there was someone ill, I would make sure the nanny or my mother came over, or the other grandmother came over, and I was always sort of organising crap.
Yeah.
But I was sort of pretty hands-on relative to the fact that I was trying to run a business.
Yeah.
And I was running the Wizard business in those days, so it was sort of pretty full on, and I had a pretty full on partner who was sort of very demanding of me. So, and that's not James, that's Kerry. So I had really. But I wonder where I got the energy from. Like today, I know I couldn't do it. I just.
Well, no, because you're older.
I'm older. I just don't have that energy.
Or the patience, I think.
And do you think you get into a fog when you're a mum or a dad and you're sort of you're just doing? Look,
yeah,
you're not standing back thinking about it.
No, well, I mean, you have no choice. Whereas that's what's so lovely about being a grandparent is that you can actually enjoy it because it's for shorter periods of time.
How old is your grandchild?
She's 1.5. So even if she stays the night and she wakes up, I don't even care because it's one night. Like, I don't care. Yeah, I can sleep in the next day. Like,
correct. You're not thinking about all your stuff.
No, you're not like, oh, I've got to get to work tomorrow and put the load of washing on and get dinner and, it's like you feel quite beleaguered.
Does she get into bed with you?
When your kids are little. No, she sleeps in a little sleeping bag. I'm very strict about, well, not strict, but I follow all the rules that my son puts down for this is her routine and I wouldn't dare cross that. You got one son? My eldest is 27. My daughter is 18, and then I've got a younger son who's 16.
So you got two sons and a daughter.
Still at school, yeah. I've got a child. My husband's biggest fear is that we'd still have kids at school while we had grandchildren, and hey, it's come to pass. But I'm stoked because I wanted more than 3 kids. Yeah. So I feel like I've got a little bit of that.
At 18 months old or 1.5 years, they're walking. They're actually that's toddler level. And that's when they're a little bit mischievous.
Yeah.
What do you do?
Their personalities come out.
But it's also great. What do you do? Is your house like childproof?
We play with my jewelry. I've got a room set up for her. She loves reading books. We go to the park. But we're a family of homebodies. I like hanging out at home and just mucking around.
Yeah. But do you childproof your house? Like sort of you're running around making sure, oh God, there's a corner on that table. Yeah, you have
to buy all the new stuff. Like you have to buy a cot again, you have to buy pram again and a high chair and all that stuff I'd just completely forgotten about. And nappies and, a lot of the stuff stayed the same. But there's, a few funky new inventions. I like a funky new pram.
And are you one of those grandparents, I try to be, who tries to be constructive with the kid, for example, relative to the way I was with my kids growing up? I just happy for them to get up, eat their food and go back to sleep.
Yeah.
As opposed to now when George is there, he's a 7-year-old, I'm always trying to give him constructive things to do, like Lego, let's make something, let's do something. Like I try to be more educational.
No, I just want to be fun.
You want to be fun?
Yes, I just want to be fun. And that's one of the things I love. There's no pressure. Like if she doesn't have all the food groups at my house, oh well. We just have fun. I feel no pressure to tick all the boxes and do all the things.
I'm the opposite. I'm the tiger granddad.
Are you?
Yeah. That's weird. I'm the tiger granddad. I'm going, well, he's got to be able to, bounce a basketball, hit the puncher pads.
I know. I forget all that stuff. Like I forget, like even with my third, I sort of forgot that I had to teach him things like how to tie shoelaces, how to answer the phone. Like I sort of, because there was such a big gap between my kids, it was like I've been a parent for so long and now I'm now being a grandparent. So I've never been very good. I'm good at the life lessons, like the teaching about, feminism. And I love nothing more than having my kids trapped in the car with me so I can deliver a lecture.
Your kids are good
about life.
What about grandkids?
Well, I don't talk to, she's too little to absorb my life lessons. Yeah. But particularly, I love a car of teenage boys on the way to sport where I can just give them a little bit of coaching about life and about women and about consent and about how to be a good guy.
That's interesting because...
and they usually try to get out of the car while it's still moving to get away from me.
Thanks, Mrs. Freedman.
Yeah.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay.
Well, 16-year-olds are a pretty interesting age group. 15, 16 is a pretty interesting age group of boys these days.
I love 16-year-old boys.
They're pretty aware.
They're so funny. My son's group of friends are just so funny and interesting and quirky and... they're just good kids. They're just really interesting, good kids. I love talking to, younger people. My daughter's friends as well.
But when they're that age, I mean, you can get the boys who are not sulky, but it's not cool to talk to mum or be seen as talking to mum in front of my mates.
Yeah, they've come out of that. He's come out of that, luckily. That always breaks my heart, that phase. At least I was prepared for it because it happened with my eldest. But I find those years between about 12 and about 16 really hard. I really miss them because they don't even, you touch them and they literally flinch.
What did you touch me for?
Like they recoil from you, and that breaks my heart. But then they come back around this age.
We're just talking about because it's interesting you just said to me about, you might talk to them about life lessons, things that you've learned and experienced and things that you're passionate about. And, and that is, I don't want to say women's rights, feminism generally, but in the broader sense, and all those things that go with it.
Yeah.
And, the position of women in society. I actually reared most of my sons on my own. So it was me and the 4 sons. And then we had a male dog as well. And one of the things that I noticed that when they all went out on their own, they left home at 18, 19, 20, they'd had very little experience with females other than my mother. And that was more a grandmother.
Did they go to boys' schools as well?
Yeah, they were Cranbrook and Scots.
And I think that's really, really challenging.
Yeah.
I think that single-sex education is problematic, particularly if kids don't have siblings of the opposite sex at home. I think it can mean that, and I went to a girls' high school, but it can mean that weekends can just be about hooking up. Like you're so focused on the hookup, you almost don't have time to have girls as friends or boys as friends unless you're in a sort of a group, which I had growing up because my best friend had a twin brother. So we had this big group of girls and boys, and my son has that as well. They have a big group of girls and guys that are all mates. But I think it's so important to have friends of the opposite sex.
Well, given that you're someone who's, you operate in this environment largely, what would you have said to someone like me and during that period? Because I was acutely unaware of what might be the consequences of not having them exposed to enough women in their life, influential women I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And they all relied on each other quite heavily because I was always flying overseas to work. So we had a nanny there, but she was Japanese, couldn't speak hardly any English, and she would sort of take over when I was away. And the boys had sort of pretty much run riot. What I mean by that, not in a bad way, but they owned the house, they owned the place because there's 4 of them, and they ranged from 19 down to 9, and probably a bit overwhelming for the poor girl when I think about it in hindsight. But I never used to think about that sort of stuff, and but I didn't really have an alternative. I guess I could have sold them to I could have sold them to, but I could have sent them to a co-ed school. But I wasn't aware of those things. Maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I was just totally unaware of having proper balance for them. I only became aware of it when they got older. What would you say to someone like that? Because there must be other men in those situations.
I just think they learn a lot by how the men in their life treat women and talk about women. I think that you model that behavior, whether it's how the men in their life treat their mother or their grandmother or their aunts or their, a waitress or, someone that works in their house or that works for them or their teacher. It's how you talk about women. It's how you talk about women that you know, how you talk about women that you don't know, women that are in the news, women, and I think they learn a lot about how to be in the world just by osmosis. It's not, for all of my life lessons in the car, it's not really that. It's the quantity exposure that they get, because kids' biggest role models are always their parents, and they have the most exposure to their parents in most cases. So I think that it's about that.
Interesting. So probably what I should have been doing at that time is, because I was very close to my mother and my sister, I probably should have been exposing them. Well, I did expose them a bit, but I should have exposed them more to those things. It's funny because I just never grew up aware of those things. Maybe it's a generational thing too. For my generation, men were men, women were women. Men went to work, provided, the women stayed home, mind the kids. If the husband and wife never sort of crossed paths because when he got home, she was going to bed or because she was too tired. That was pretty normal. Certainly when I grew up. And I'm a firm believer monkey see, monkey do.
Exactly.
It doesn't matter what you get told. You said by osmosis, and as you said that, I'm thinking, well, observation. I observed, I did. And my sons probably observed me. I wasn't disrespectful to women, but I just had no women in my life. I didn't even have a girlfriend. Like I didn't want to do that because I didn't want to challenge them with that. So I was just, Dad went to work, Dad came home and looked up and, mucked around with the boys and told them to do the homework, go to bed. And then Dad would go on a work trip and come back a week later.
I don't know how you would have constructed that, like without it, it's not like, let's go and be around some women. Like, I don't know if you can sort of do that, but it's, I think one of the toughest things for boys and girls is seeing the opposite sex as the other. Yeah. And, I remember saying to my son, he really appreciated, we were on the way to school one day, he had like an exam, he was in the middle of his exams, and something had happened in the US. I think it was the Supreme Court, Roe versus Wade or something, and I was trying to explain that the rights to reproductive rights, like the abortion being legal, is not just a women's issue. It's also a man's issue, because if you accidentally get a girl pregnant, which you probably will in your lifetime at some stage, guess what? That is half of your problem. And if she doesn't have access to abortion legally, and I was giving this whole and it's like, can I please just study for my French exam? And I was like, okay, yeah, but it's really important.
So can I just, do you mind if I just check a little bit? I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of stuff written about you on Wikipedia, but I know half the stuff from Wikipedia. With the greatest respect to Wikipedia, is incorrect. I know that my birthday is on there sometime in November, and that's like my birthday was in June. So what my team produced to me is probably incorrect. So can I go back, Mia Freedman as a young kid?
Yeah.
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Sydney.
Brothers and sisters?
An older brother, 7 years older. Yeah.
And mum and dad?
Yeah.
Divorced, married?
No, married, still married.
Happily married?
Yeah.
And your dad?
My dad was started his own business when I was probably in late primary school. So it was like he had a business partner. He'd worked in, he'd been a sort of a stockbroker, went out on his own, entrepreneur. It was very much the two families, because it was his business partner was his cousin's husband, and they kind of built literally from the kitchen table. Like, I have very strong memories of the two families sort of grew up together, and it was, we'd be putting things in envelopes and sending them out, the kids, and we'd be walking, trying to think of names for the business. So we watched that happen. I wasn't, he was an immigrant from South Africa. So his whole family came over as a political protest to apartheid in the 60s, because that's the only way you could protest apartheid, is by leaving. And they had a great life there. His father was a doctor and his mother was an artist, and white people had great lives in South Africa during apartheid, but they found it absolutely abhorrent, and they left in protest and came to Australia with nothing and had to start again. So I did not grow up in a house with money. My mum, her father's a doctor, but, very working class and middle class. And
she was Australian, or? Yeah,
Australian, back to the convicts. And so, I grew up in a house that was, kind of typical 70s, where the parents were doing their own thing. A parent was something you were, not something that you did. To kind of normal, regular childhood. And my dad's business became really successful probably when I was in my late years of primary school, but it kind of wasn't really overnight. So I had entrepreneur in my world.
You saw it?
Sense. Yeah, I saw it. I saw what it looked like.
But watching your dad starting a startup, doing a startup.
Yeah, it was very much a startup.
With his business partner.
Before that word existed, yeah.
Yeah, very much a startup. Yeah. And this is the funds management business.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was pretty new. I don't know if you know that, but it was there was a lot of it going on in the US. It got exported or imported from the US to Australia. We didn't really have funds management, definitely in the 80s, there was a few people talking about it. It was nowhere near as prevalent as it was in the United States. Mm. And then a few people like your dad and his business partner started to have a crack at these things, but it wasn't easy to raise the money. It wasn't easy to get
No,
people
they
to.
travelled a lot and they raised money in Australia, went overseas, got money to be invested in Australia. And, I remember any kid whose parents run a business and grows up in that family, there are really tough times and there are scary times and the stakes are high and, there's highs and a lot of highs and lows.
Could you see that? I mean, as a young girl, how old would you been? Like 10,
I remember
12, 15?
I remember the stock market crash. That was terrifying.
The 87?
Yeah. I was 16 then, and that was like shockwaves through the world. But I was not protected from that. Like that was a potentially ruinous.
What happened? Like, I mean, not
I
about
can't remember.
What did you feel though?
Fear
in the household.
Absolute terror.
Is
this the end?
Because the 87 stock market crash was a big deal. Like it was huge,
yeah,
massive. And your dad's fund would have been investing in the stock market. So what in those days people do is maybe I'm a high net worth person. I'll put in maybe $1 million into the fund. And the objective was your dad would vest mine and all my other friends' money. In those days, they would invest in the stock market. They didn't really invest in startups and private equity stuff in those days, but they invest in the stock market. Stock market crashes. Do you have any sense of, as a teenager, the devastation the anxiety that your father would have been experiencing?
Oh, massive. I mean, my whole childhood was just anxiety before I realized that I actually had anxiety, which was only sort of much later in my life. I was an incredibly anxious child because there was also the threat of nuclear war because it was the Cold War with Russia and America. So I lived and then there was also AIDS. So that was the 80s. So the 80s was just the worst time to grow up because between the stock market crash, AIDS, and the Cold War, we were a generation that was just terrified, constantly terrified.
Well, the AIDS made you terrified.
AIDS, absolutely, because we came of age sexually when sex was connected with death. And so that was our introduction to sex, that it could kill you.
Yeah.
And the Simon Reynolds Grim Reaper ads and everything was scary. My memory of my childhood and adolescence was just terror, absolute terror.
How did you become aware of those things? Because it's pretty unusual that certainly in my household, at that stage I had a teenage son, close enough to a teenage son. I would not have brought home the newspaper to him. How is it that Mia Freedman was aware of that? Was it from TV? I mean, the ads are on television, but did you watch the news?
My parents were always very, my mother's always been heavily into social justice and used to take us on Palm Sunday anti-nuclear marches when all my friends at school were, going to tennis days and stuff. We'd be in the city carrying placards, going to no nukes marches. So I grew up with a real understanding of the world and social justice and politics, and because my father had come from South Africa, all of those conversations would happen around our table. And I was fascinated always in the news and information and what we would now call content. But I used to love magazines. I would, watch magazines were my thing as a kid growing up because that was the only women's media. Any magazines I could get my hand on. I mean, Cleo was my go-to and favorite and gold star, but everything from, of course, I started with Dolly and followed Lisa Wilkinson through her career. But I would buy Women's Weekly, I'd buy Women's Day, I would buy New Idea because there was no other medium that really at that time spoke to women and that covered issues that were relevant to women. And I don't just mean like lipstick and sex, but like relationships, career, physical health, all of those kinds of things. They would all be in women's magazines. So that was when I was a really lonely kid. So all I wanted to do was read magazines, and it just drove me crazy that they would only come out, most of them once a month.
How do you mean you were lonely? Like in that, there's a
my
gap
brother
between
was
your
7 years older, so that was a big gap. And I, now I know that I had ADHD, so I was like bored. I needed a lot of stimulation, and I didn't have it. Like I didn't have anyone to play with on the weekends, and my parents were kind of busy with their own lives. And so I would love I would just go and buy magazines. I spent a lot of time with my dog, and I would just go up to the shops and save all my pocket money to buy magazines and lollies.
I'm just sort of having an imagination of you sitting at home, sitting on your bed with reading your magazine.
Yeah, and cutting things out and sticking them on my wall and sticking them in my school diary and on my school folders.
Oh, more than that. No, more than just reading. You were participating with the magazine.
Yeah, as much as you could. And it's funny you say that, because one of the wonderful things about the internet, and that has been so revelatory for women, is the two-way, engagement. You couldn't really engage with magazines unless you wrote a letter to Dolly Doctor, or that was pretty much all you could do. But, I'd cut them out, and I wanted to become them. Yeah,
that's it. Very interesting. Because not too many people, and I often say this to people, if you want to be good at something, you got to take the next step. Just don't read about it. Cut it out. Even today, or if you're reading online, it's a bit different. But maybe you Photoshop it and you put it in record it somewhere, which is
anyone can make content now.
But you got to get the content, and you got to be part of it. You got to be participatory, as opposed to just being an observer, just reading. Oh, okay, the next thing, because then it becomes part of your brain's DNA. You really get it inside your head. And Dolly magazine and Cleo, I remember them because my girlfriend at the time, who became my wife, she used to get all the magazines, and she used to always make you do those quizzes,
and stuff,
relationship quizzes,
and that was interactive.
Are you suited?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was like, in a media that didn't speak to women or care about women, and a culture that kind of didn't really rate women and was very focused on men, women's magazines were where we built our communities around these brands. And, the old joke is that Dolly taught you what an orgasm was, Cleo taught you how to have one, Cosmo taught you how to fake one, and the Women's Weekly taught you how to knit one. And then you died. And so it was like we built our communities around these brands, and we moved from brand to brand as we got older and our interests and our life stage changed. And it was really powerful, which is why it's just such a travesty and yet an opportunity for me that when I went on to work for those magazines and edit some of them, that company didn't understand that what they had were incredible brands. They had the most amazing collateral in those brands that they just pissed into the wind. And it's so sad that there's no Cleo, there's no Dolly. Even brands like the Bulletin, there was these incredible brands that meant so much and that should have become these iconic digital brands across different platforms. And they were just, part of the reason I left magazines was because I got tired of trying to explain to my bosses that Armageddon was coming in the form of the internet, and that we needed to move, we needed to evolve. And they were like, no, we're a magazine company. The internet's a fad.
We're a print
company, yep. And magazines are a fad. And anything that we put on our website for the magazines is just to get people to buy the magazine. And we don't want to, if we put content online, then they won't buy the magazine, and that's our business model.
Yeah, they want to bastardize the magazine.
They thought it was going to be killing the golden goose, and in fact, they killed the golden goose by not seeing what was happening under their nose.
Before we move past that, what was your first introduction to working in magazines?
Doing work experience at Cleo.
And who'd you work under?
Lisa Wilkinson.
Wow.
And Deborah Thomas. Yeah.
Yeah, Deb.
I mean, iconic.
How's Deb going?
Amazing. I had dinner with them both last night, and some
awesome.
of my Cleo friends. So that was the most incredible education that I could have got. To work at the knee of those women and to be in that building in Park Street during that time of when the Packers owned it, and it was Nene King, and it wasn't Ida Buttrose, but it was like Lisa and Pat Ingram and, absolute icons. And Richard Walsh and then Nick Chan and even later John Alexander, JA, to be around those people was an absolute privilege. And that was my university, because I dropped out of university almost immediately, and that was my university.
How'd you score the job? I mean, how did you get that job?
I just wrote a letter, and it was to Lisa, and to just can I love Maggie? It wasn't a very original letter. And, she came and said, I knew someone else who'd been a guy actually, who'd been doing work experience a day a week. And that was my dream. And, I think I sort of used his name to get in the door. And, in my naivety, I thought Lisa would offer me a job, but like wow, I was a 19-year-old, 18-year-old. I had no experience, nothing. And she said, I remember exactly what she said in that conversation. She said, because she was no doubt used to a lot of people going, oh, magazines, it's glamorous. I didn't want to go to the photo shoots. I wanted, like, she was my hero, not the models on the cover.
Yeah.
It was Lisa. I wanted to be in the office. I wanted with the disgusting carpet that was masking tape down and the shit falling from the ceiling and the little rabbit warren. Kerry didn't get rich by spending money on his offices. But that's where I wanted to be, learning at the knee of those incredible women. And that's where I spent the next pretty much 15 years of my career.
It's pretty full on though, as a 19-year-old, thinking that way, especially as opposed to playing the ball, the magazine. You played the man, the woman. In this case, you played the player.
Yeah.
So you actually wanted to be with Lisa Wilkinson. What did she? What did she represent to you? Like, and how did you know Lisa was as important a person potentially in terms of characteristics as you did know about? Like most people, was she the editor of?
She'd been the youngest ever editor in Australia.
How'd you know
Dolly
about
of
that?
21. Well, because I'd read Dolly as a 8-year-old or 9-year-old or whatever, and my favourite thing was Lisa's editor's letter at the front of the magazine. And it's so funny that editor's letters ended up becoming, these airbrushed glamour shots, but Lisa was always very relatable. She had this long hair and she had like glasses and she looked like a regular girl. Like she was my idol, absolutely. And then meeting her and just learning so much from her over the time that I was there before she, left and had a baby and went on maternity leave. And I can't remember if she came back before she had her second child, but sitting with her and Deborah. And the most important thing Lisa ever taught me was something that's a core value at Mamamia now, which is walk in her shoes. And she didn't use those exact words, but she always said, look, we're making this magazine not for ourselves, not to impress our peers or other people at other magazines or our friends. We're making it for our readers. And so every photo shoot that you're on, every cover line you write, every story you pitch, don't think about what you want to put out to the audience. Think about what it looks like from their point of view. And that has been something I've never forgotten, and that has informed every career decision I've ever made and every content decision I've ever made is walk in her shoes.
That's funny because that's what Kerry used to say to me. He used to say, I couldn't give a damn what you think borrowers want. I want you to work out what they want, and that's what you talk to them about.
Yeah.
And that's the only reason we're in business.
A lot of people make content for themselves or to impress other people, and that's one thing to do, but that's never been interesting to me. The way I've always edited, the way I've always thought about content is not through the eyes of me to them, but from through their eyes, what they can see, what they can hear.
And who's your consumer, in other words?
Yeah, who's your consumer, and always be the eyes and ears of your consumer.
That's and how would you find out what your consumer wanted? I mean, you're a survey of you're an N of one, just one in the whole algorithm. So it's good to look at yourself and what I think I would like to see as a consumer. But how do you find out what your consumers wanted? I mean, would you? Let's just elevate you now from the 19-year-old who just started.
Yeah.
And you became the editor. You became the editor of which magazine? Cosmo.
Cosmo, yeah.
Yeah. You became the editor of Cosmo. What would you say to your team in terms of finding out at that point what your audience wants? Was it survey based?
Surveys are always unreliable, so is market research, because you'll often, those market researchers back in the magazine days, people would say, like, numbers don't lie. So people would say, oh, well, you should have more interesting people on the cover. Like, I remember someone saying to me in the 90s, you should have like Natasha Stott-Despoja on the cover. She was the head of the Democrat Party back then. And it's like, oh, you should have this one on the cover or that one on the cover. But the covers that sold were very different. So what people say they want and what they actually want, the numbers don't lie. And same with digital, even more so now. But in terms of how before we had this intense feedback loop that digital media gives you, where you are not short of anyone's opinion in real time, and the analytics that you have can literally show you what works and what doesn't work. back then, I've always had this real split in me because I'm such a consumer of women's media. I'm always able to split between me, the creator, and me, the consumer. And I'm always just able to flip. I can't even explain it. But sometimes when I'm talking to people, I'll say, I don't understand that headline. I'm really confused by what, and they're like, but you know what that headline, and I don't mean me, Mia. I mean me. I'll slip into first person as the voice of the audience.
You get into their shoes.
Yeah, walking in her shoes, and someone who comes to it without assumed knowledge, without having read the whole article. She's just reading the headline. That doesn't make sense. That headline only makes sense if you've read the whole article. And I'm just able to flip. I can't explain how. I'm just always able to flip and put myself in the shoes of other women.
Do you think it's fair to say
I don't know why.
that, because I've noted this sometimes, that when experts on a topic have conversations, they're generally speaking, when they're talking to an audience, they're having a conversation with themselves about what they know, as opposed to having a conversation with the audience about what the audience is actually out there to find out about them.
Yeah.
We all can do it. We tend to, and I know it happens to me when it comes to interest rates. I forget that I've got an audience who doesn't know maybe anything about interest rates and just wants me to break it down for them in a certain way. But sometimes I slip into the same mistake all the time, is I start having a conversation with myself, with Mark. And it's Mark talking to Mark.
Yeah.
And where in your case, you've got experts who know what the topic is, and therefore they put the headline up that reads well to themselves.
Yeah,
It's a bit like writing a speech and then getting up and speaking what you wrote, and it sounds sounds really dull relative to what you thought you wrote.
You've always got to be clean skin. Like, if I'm thinking about the first thing I asked you when we sat down was just tell me a bit about your audience, because I'm thinking about what's going to be interesting to your audience, because I will give different answers than if I was doing a podcast about fashion, or a podcast pitched to women in business, or a podcast pitched to news or content creators. And it's not that the answers aren't authentic, but it's like, okay, I need to thin slice and package up the most interesting thing for this audience in a way that's most interesting to them. Not what do I want to talk about today, because that's a whole other thing.
Yeah, we're not sitting down and have a cup of coffee.
We're not here to hear what I want to talk about today.
Or me for that matter.
Yeah.
And by the way, that's part of the skill of podcasting, isn't it? Like, I mean, it's about my audience doesn't really give a damn what I think anyway. They're more interested in hearing what Mia Freedman's got to say.
I don't know. I think podcasting is different. I think that, and you look at, all you have to do is look at the US election. I think the difference between podcasting and traditional interviewing on news media, like say 7:30 or 60 Minutes.
A 3-minute clip.
Yeah, it's that. And it's also, that's about, I get you. Whereas a podcast is about getting to know you.
Yeah. And
that's why Donald Trump went to Austin and sat down for Joe Rogan for 3 hours. And that was a really smart use of his time. And the other biggest cut through was Kamala Harris's interview with Alex Cooper from Call Her Daddy, which she paid for Alex to come to her, but still did it in Alex's format. So, it's interesting. You look at, we've just seen the first podcast election, and we've got our election in Australia next year. And it will be really interesting to see what happens, because at the last election, I remember so clearly, we're the biggest women's media company in the world, in Australia. We have the biggest podcast network in the world. We speak to 8 million Australian women every month. Anthony Albanese, straight away, yes, I'll come talk to you. I'll sit down, do no filter. Scott Morrison wouldn't have a bar of us, would not do it. And I remember, it's not like he wasn't here, because he came and talked to you.
He did, twice.
And I remember that day, I'm like, he's literally up the road, because we are 100 metres down the road, our office, and he wouldn't come to Mamamia.
He didn't ask,
he
or
refused.
he would?
We asked him for months. We said, it's not a gotcha. We just want to sit down. Anthony Albanese's come on No Filter. We want to give you the same opportunity. I mean, I'm not Lee Sales. I'm not going to give him a grilling. It was just an open invitation with no expectations.
He probably also should talk to Lee Sales too, to be frank with you.
And he did.
Yeah,
of course he did.
Yeah, but he should.
But I'm not saying it's an instead of.
Yeah.
But the fact that he was always, and Tony Abbott was the same. I've interviewed every Australian Prime Minister since I've, over the last 15 years, except for Tony Abbott and Scott Morrison, who would not sit down with me. And it's like, why? Why would you? And it's not about me, anyone at Mamamia. They would not engage with Mamamia. They gave interviews to all kinds of people, you twice, but they would not give an interview to the biggest women's media company in Australia. What does that say? You know, we were talking earlier about attitudes to women. What does that say about their understanding of 50% of their electorate? 51% of their electorate, actually. Their disdain for and their understanding of the influence that women have. Like, it's almost like these men have such old-fashioned ideas about women. It's like, oh, they'll just vote the way their husband tells them. Like, I don't know what they were thinking, but it didn't go well for either of them.
That's sort of the assumption anyone could make, whether they think that way or not. It could be definitely
in 2020 in
definitely
this
assumption
century.
Yeah.
Who could make the assumption that women will just vote the way their men tell them to?
Well, it's interesting because has Peter Dutton reached out to you?
No, but we've reached out to him. So we've opened up an invitation for, you know, we know that the election's going to be sometime in the next 9 months. The invitation's there for Peter Dutton to come on Mamamia Out Loud, which is our flagship show, and it's the third biggest podcast in Australia of any kind. And, of course, Anthony Albanese. Now, I hope, like, it would be madness for him not to. We've seen what happened in America. Like, I think one of the biggest mistakes Kamala made was not going to sit down with Joe Rogan. I think that was a really missed opportunity. I'm not saying it would have moved the election, but I just think that idea of is really old-fashioned. Scott will only talk to you and Abbott will only talk to you because you're a man. Like, we won't talk to – it's like, come on, those days are over.
It's really interesting you should make that point because Dutton actually is coming on our show.
Yeah.
And they reach out to us. But
of course.
And I'll be saying –
that's the thing. They'll reach out to you, but it won't occur to them, even though women are responsible for – I think it's 80% of purchasing decisions in Australia. This is why smart advertisers advertise to women. Because this idea that women aren't just responsible for like buying the breakfast cereal and the washing powder, finance, investment, insurance, banking, cars, real estate. Women are incredibly influential, or if not entirely responsible, for making those decisions.
I know that's our experience in the lending business.
The purchasing power of women is extraordinary. 100%. The voting power of women is extraordinary. And the thing about women is that women are kind of programmed to be viral. Like the word of mouth and the amplification of your message when you put it in the mouths of women, or you can get women to engage with you, is untold.
Well,
Men don't amplify.
Look at this camera. What would you say to Peter Dutton? Because I want to show him this clip when he comes on the show. What would you say to Peter in this camera?
I'm not going to look down the camera because, to be honest, I think Peter Dutton needs women more than women need Peter Dutton. I think it's his game to lose in that sense, in winning the hearts and minds of women.
Does he just need to win them, or does he just need to introduce himself at least?
Yeah, I think it's that. And I mean, it used to be, they'd go and do an interview with the Women's Weekly, which Scott Morrison did last election campaign, and he did 60 Minutes and he played his ukulele. But that part of the audience is absolutely dwindling. Like, if you want to reach women over the age of 18 up to about 55, you know, Mamamia is where they are. We've got 64 different podcasts. We've got, you know, between our social, our written content, this idea that women are somehow a niche is just kind of, it is laughable.
Well, given the voting in this country is compulsory too, it just doesn't make sense mathematically.
Correct.
I mean, it's funny you should say that about Morrison, because I've invited Albo on this show and Jim Chalmers so many times.
And they won't come.
They won't come on my show, which is interesting that he goes on your show. I don't know if it's, in my case, I don't think it's necessarily my audience, and I don't think it's necessarily men versus women or their views. I think it's more about what they think my politics is, because I've had Scott Morrison on. And I'm not here to pull Albo's pants down. I just want to talk to him about his story.
Of course.
That's what my show's about.
Of course. And that's the thing. It's not a gotcha.
I don't bring anyone undone.
That political leaders and their advisors have not got that message, that podcasts aren't a hostile environment. No. I mean, I'm not Lee Sales. You're not Kerry O'Brien. Like, if only I bow down to those people, but that's not what a podcast is. It's just not. And it actually is the best way for someone to introduce themselves and to, tell people who they are. And it's like, I wouldn't be interested. I'm not the best person. And Alex Cooper said this when she interviewed Kamala, to sit down and talk about fracking and talk about the economy necessarily. But she spoke to her about reproductive rights and about abortion because that is such a critical issue for women. As it turned out, it wasn't such a critical issue when it came to voting. But there's just not a lot of downside. There's not a lot of downside because I think what people expect now, not just from politicians but from public figures, is not just a soundbite. It's to understand who are they really. Because if there's one thing people always say about Donald Trump, you know who he is.
Yeah, you know what you're going to get.
You know what you're going to get. And whether you think what you get is awful or spectacular, And going into this election in the US, I think it was 85% of people said they will not have their mind changed about Donald Trump. No matter what they thought about him, good or bad, their mind was made up and nothing that could be said or done to change their mind. And I think that's really interesting.
Do you think that in terms of Trump anyway, do you think his propensity that I just don't care what people think, I'll go on any podcast. Do you think it's his sort of
But he didn't, because he didn't go on Alex Cooper.
Right.
So he only goes on Friendly. He only goes on Friendlies. And I understand, like politicians go on Friendlies.
But
and that's
Rogan
why Kamala
wasn't
didn't want to do Rogan.
Rogan wasn't necessarily friendly.
Rogan's very friendly.
Do you think
Rogan's very friendly. And I think he would have been fine to Kamala. I don't think he would have been awful. But to Donald Trump, he was very friendly, friendly.
As opposed to not being unfriendly.
Well, as opposed to calling him out on his bullshit.
Yeah.
He's not going to do that because that's just not the kind of podcast that he has.
Yeah.
You can go on to Rogan and pretty much talk about yourself for 3 hours and he'll just kind of let you.
Yeah. Which is sort of what both of us do.
Yeah, for sure. Exactly. Yeah. We're not interested in having someone there to tell them what we think.
Yeah, that's the nature of podcast.
Yeah. That's how podcasts work. And that's why podcasts are index so much higher for women than they do for men. And that's why for us at Mamamia, so much of our business is built on audio and on our podcast network.
Can I go back to Mamamia then? Just kicked off early 2000s?
2008 actually, yeah.
But it started as a blog?
2007. Yeah, it started as a blog. Yep, just
me.
Because
blogs is a thing.
Yeah, it was just someone writing on the internet really. And it wasn't a personal blog, so it was always going to be about, just what I wanted to write about really, what I thought might be interesting to people. Because back in that time, there were women's websites were they were very net specific. They were about cooking, or they were about gossip, or they were about fashion, or they were about parenting. And I was interested in all of those things, but I was also interested in news and pop culture. And every other woman I know was not just interested in one of those things. So it made sense to me to have a blog and then a website and now a media company that covers all of those things, because this idea of women's issues, it's very different looking at the world through a female lens versus women's issues. All issues are women's issues. But what we do at Mamamia, I guess, is look at it through a female lens, because most of the media tends to look at it through a male lens just by virtue of the fact that most media companies, in fact, pretty much all media companies are run by men. So I just saw, a gap in the market, and then I established that there was a market in that gap. And then I'd been growing an audience, but I was a one-woman operator and I was completely exhausted. And my husband had sold his business. He'd been in the liquor industry and he was looking for something to invest his time in. And he'd sold his company. And so he came on board as a co-founder after about 18 months. And he said, let's try and monetize this in the next 12 months, or because I hadn't earned a cent in 2 years, or it's time to, it's going to be time to get another job because we've got a mortgage to pay. And so he came on board and we did. We monetized it. We were profitable, I think, in that first year, which was not as impressive as it sounds, because it was just him and me and we weren't earning any money.
You were paying
there was no one else to pay.
Yeah.
So we were profitable. But then we just slowly moved into a little tiny office and slowly started hiring people. And of course, nobody wanted to really come and do this thing. The internet was still a bit untested, and we just grew from there. And now we've got about 150 people, and we're sort of a pretty big, not a small business anymore.
When two people, husband and wife, sitting there at the coffee table or whatever, the kitchen table, and I often wonder about, let's say at that stage your husband wasn't involved and you were doing your blogs. I often wonder is a blog for some people therapy?
That's a really interesting. It was for some people. I think what was amazing about the rise of blogging, particularly the parenting bloggers of around that time, which I never was, but I was very influenced by them. It was this very flourishing way of women to communicate to other women in a way where there was no gatekeeper. So there wasn't
no edit,
and there was no one saying, well, that's interesting to people or that's not interesting to people. And there was no is that going to be interesting to enough people to be able to monetize it through advertising? It was just women expressing how they felt about things, and it was an amazing time. It was fairly short-lived, but it was an amazing time. And for me, I wasn't interested in writing personally particularly, but I was interested in being the one. I'd been an editor for so long, and then an editor-in-chief with lots of magazines under me at ACP, and I'd been sort of managing people and teaching other people and editing other people for so long. I've spent a lot of my career climbing up the ladder because I'm very ambitious, but then realizing I don't really like it up there and climbing back down and wanting to get back to the coalface without anyone between me and an audience and just wanting to communicate directly. And that's what I love. And ironically, I'm in the process of that at the moment, again, de-escalating, coming back to the coalface where I can just create directly for an audience.
And what are the signs that you and your husband saw that either encouraged him or you or both of you to think, hang on, he's gonna take on the co-founder role, and we're gonna monetize this. What did you say? You had 1,000 followers?
Exactly what it was. No, there were probably about 10,000 or more people coming every day to read what I was writing. I was doing about 6 posts a day on my own.
Per day?
Per day.
Wow.
There were thousands of comments. I was moderating every single comment. Like, I had no one to work for me. It was literally me walking around with my laptop in my house. And then I had another baby during that time. But the reason that he realized there was something there is because I kept getting approached by private equity who wanted to start things and get me to run them for them. And he would come with
space.
Me. Yeah, there was a big thing at the time called Daily Candy out of the US, which was a daily email that would like do a roundup of the best kind of deals and fashion things and various things. And so everyone wanted to get into this women's digital space. And so I'd get Jace to come to these meetings with me, and
Jace being your husband,
Jason Levine being my husband, and you know we went to a couple, and it was like, why on earth would we go and work for these clowns to make something for women when I know how to do this? We're doing it. Like, so that's where he was like, well, if they can see something in it. And he was starting at Harvard at the time, and he used Mamamia because he didn't have his business. He just sold his business before he'd started this 3-year Harvard course. And he used Mamamia as a model because they had to sort of plug in their business. Yeah. Not a case study, but they had to plug in their own businesses to these things they were learning. And he used Mamamia at the time, and it just made him see the potential there. And I was getting all these approaches, but I didn't have the bandwidth or the skills, to be honest, to monetize any of the approaches I was getting. So for a while, he was managing me, and people would get me to come and, they wanted me to be the brand ambassador for their whatever, and he would do those deals. And then he's like, there's a business here potentially. And he could see that I was completely burning out and I didn't have the capacity to monetize it myself. And I also didn't have a business plan. I didn't know how to do a business plan. He was like, what's your exit? You're not, and I'm like, I don't know. Rupert Murdoch will come along and buy me. And he's like, buy what? It's you and your laptop. There's nothing to buy. And I was like, I couldn't see that because I was just so caught up in it. And he was the one that's always had the vision. I've always been really good at this, and he's always been the one that can see over the horizon and been like, no, Mamamia needs to be a website that you edit. And I'm like, oh no, that'll never work. or he's like, Mamamia needs to, and I'm like, oh no, that'll never work. And then he's right and he's right and he's right. So we've been a really good combination, whereas he's very much steered the business and the financial side of it and everything other than the content, and I've steered the content. And it's worked, really well for 17 years. And one of the most dangerous times for any startup, and I'm much more suited to startup culture, I've realized, but he always had much bigger ambitions. And the most dangerous time for a business we knew was going from startup to scale up, because culturally it's a big shift. The people that you hire as generalists, you then move to needing specialists. It's a big risk moving up, and he managed us through that. He's been an outstanding CEO, managing through all of those rocky waters and through COVID and we tried to, not everything we've done has worked. We tried to expand into the US. That didn't work. So we closed that down and decided to really focus here. But probably the biggest thing for us was when Facebook told everybody to pivot to video. They told publishers to pivot to video, and everybody sacked their writers, invested all this money, started making video, pivoted, and then Facebook went, oh, yeah, nah. Yeah, nah. And that was sort of the beginning of the end for the BuzzFeeds, the Vices, and they just ended up getting more and more investment, more and more needing more and more, doing bigger and bigger cap raises to fund this bigger and bigger expansion. And because we've never done that, we've always been in control of our own destiny. And that's a decision that Jason made, because he knew that, and I would say, oh, how come they've got all this cap raising and we don't? And he's like, it means that we can make the best decisions for our business. So when everyone pivoted to video, we actually pivoted to audio. And that was before most people knew what a podcast was. And that ended up being a really, really good decision for us.
So just on the co-founder thing, because often people say to me, do I need a co-founder? Or some people come to me and say, I need a co-founder.
Yeah.
Because they heard someone else say that you need a co-founder.
Well, I needed a co-founder.
Well, is it better to say, though, Mia, that I'm really good at this, but I'm not so good at those things. Those things are important in my business, in the business.
Yeah.
Therefore, I'll find a co-founder who can do those things. Because, my old man my dad used to always say, just always put up on a whiteboard what you're good at.
Yeah.
But equally,
what you're
be
not
honest,
good at.
what you're crap at.
Yeah. Oh, 100%.
And, and I often say in my various businesses, and I've always had my brother involved, my younger brother involved, who's a lawyer. I say, I cut, he sews.
Nice.
Because he's really good at stitching things up, making it really nice and neat and tidy and relevant, etc. Not in terms of content, but just in terms of structure, finances, exits.
Every car needs a brake and an accelerator.
Totally. There you go.
Yeah.
So, did you, Mia, sort of recognize that your husband had those qualities?
Yes. I knew that I couldn't do, because I was just, all I knew, I was really, really good at this one thing, but I was not, there was this whole other thing that not only was I not good at, wasn't interested in becoming good at it.
Yeah.
I didn't enjoy it. It wasn't a good use of my time doing this thing that I didn't understand or wasn't good at. And so for me, not only did Jace have skills that I didn't have in terms of business and finance, but he also had a different mindset, because I have a low boredom threshold and a high appetite for risk. He is more cautious. And I think that has been in a business, if you just have unharnessed ambition or unharnessed risk appetite, that's really dangerous.
Especially if both of you have that.
Yeah, you can't. And so I think, the best partnerships, and I've always said, I ran this whole course part of the business for many years called Lady Startup, which is about helping women start businesses. And about the co-founder thing, I would always say exactly what you've said, which is either partner with someone who has different strengths to you or hire if you can afford to. And the problem is that most people, their co-founders will be like a friend or a sister or something. And I had, they'll say, oh, this is my co-founder. We're really different. Like I'm this and shit. And it's like, your differences are like this.
Yeah.
You need differences that are like this, like where you're really, you look at some of the most successful partnerships in Australian business, Nikki and Simone Zimmerman.
Yeah. This as in a clothing brand.
The Zimmerman sisters, yeah. Nikki creative. Nicole is, I think, a lawyer by trade or maybe an accountant. And so, they're very clear about who does what. And I think that's been the key for me and Jason. There's no way I could have done this without him. And, he would have done something else without me, but it wouldn't have been this.
So it's an important point here, though, and I've seen this happen with people, especially husband and wife or boyfriend, girlfriend or brother and sister, etc., or brothers and sisters. If you have somebody like you, say with your skills and things you like doing and with a high appetite for risk, you say, and this is sort of what you're explaining to me, you say, look, I want to do this, and he will come back and he'll say, well, wait a minute. Let's just check this out and do a bit of analysis on it, blah, blah, blah.
Measure twice, cut once.
Well, would you ever get to the point where you'd say, well, hang on, don't you believe in me? This is what I believe in. Do you ever get to the point and say, I just want you to believe in me?
Yeah.
And he's going to say, well, hang on, I do believe in you, but my role is.
Correct.
Now, how do you deal with that's a small conflict there, but what would happen? Counselling,
it's really interesting. We've come to really, I bristle at being held back, and he bristles at me running headlong into something passionately. But what we've learned over the years is to trust each other. It's been proven time and time again that my instincts when I want to run hard at something, I can't often explain. With podcasts, there was no business model. I just knew that it was something we had to do. And I remember getting up in a leadership team meeting and explaining podcasts, and they all kind of laughed at me and whatever. And I'm like, no, guys, take this. And it's like, oh, Mia, we've got our business plan. We can't, we're doing, this is our strategy. We can't. And I'm like, And so I'll just go off and do it on my own. It's like Lady Startup. Jace walked past my office one day and I was on the floor and I was cutting things up, or maybe it was the very Perry Summit and I was whatever. And he's like, oh, babe, what are you doing? And I said, and he goes, oh, what's the business plan? I'm like, I'm not sure. What's the revenue attached to it? And I'm like, I'm not sure, but I'm sure I'll find it. And I always have. So whether it's been podcasts, the Very Perry Summit that I did, or the Lady Startup course.
Very Perry as in perimenopause.
Perimenopause, yeah. So they've all been become multi-million dollar parts of our business. But they didn't start off going, how can we make a lot of money? It's been, I've gone, walking in her shoes, what do women want? Okay. And then we find a way to make it financially viable to actually do it, because we're not a charity. We're a purpose-driven business, and our purpose is to make the world a better place for women and girls. So I'm always looking at what can I make that fulfills that purpose. That's kind of how it works.
So can you just list out, I know you got 50 odd podcasts or something like that in your group.
Yeah.
And I don't want you to list every one of those out, but
I won't.
What are the?
I remember them all.
I would imagine you can't. But could you just explain your model, the Mamamia model? Is it sort of an umbrella model that sort of sits? Lots of other podcasters sit inside your model.
No, we're a pure podcast network, so we're all owned and operated.
All owned and operated.
Yeah.
So you go and find the talent to do a particular podcast theme, or how's it work?
Yeah, so we will, our first podcast was Mamamia Out Loud, which is about sort of what women are talking about, and it's now a daily show. It started as a weekly show. So we built that first, and then I started doing an interview podcast called No Filter, and then we went, okay, we want to do a parenting podcast, so we found two people and we did a weekly parenting podcast.
To people to run the podcast.
Yeah, to host the podcast.
Let's call it the talent.
Yep, talent. And then you have advertisers who are like, oh, we want to advertise to parents.
Yep.
So we'll advertise on that podcast, or we'll sponsor that whole show. And then we're like, well, what else do women want? The news is pretty hectic. There's a lot of assumed knowledge in the news. How about a quick daily news podcast? So that's when we started the Quickie, which is a now twice daily news podcast. Then we did The Spill, which is a once daily entertainment podcast.
And you're finding talent for these shows every time?
Yeah, that among our writers, among our editors, in-house talent. A lot of the time now we also work with external talent, but they're our shows. We create them. We're about to launch a show called Diary of a Birth, where people tell their birth stories. We're launching a story about Once Upon a Divorce, about
I love it.
Stories about divorce. We have podcasts about true crime. We have podcasts about comedy, pop culture, different aspects of pop culture. We've done sport before, all different aspects of women's lives and areas of interest.
So the umbrella business sort of is really like you're a big publisher. Big publisher.
We're a media company.
You're a media company, correct?
Yeah.
So and underneath it, you own all the various aspects. It's a bit like the old, maybe it's a bit like News Corp. You might back when it was. There's not only the Daily Telegraph, but there's a whole lot of magazines that might sit under there, and there might be a bit of TV, a bit of
So some people say, "Are you a branded house or a house of brands?" We're actually both.
Yeah.
So we're a branded house in terms of Mamamia, but we're also a house of brands in terms of we've got the Cancelled podcast, we've got the Quickie podcast, we've got Mamamia Out Loud podcast. So we've got all these different brands. We've got a whole beauty podcast, we've got a fashion podcast, we've got a midlife podcast, we've got a mental health podcast, a wellness podcast. So we've got all these different, categories, and each of them have their own ecosystem. So around our wellness podcast, for example, there's a newsletter, there is might be a Facebook group. There might be written content on our website. There will be social accounts. So there'll be TikToks, there'll be Instagram. So, there are these ecosystems that are built around these brands as well as the podcasts themselves.
Well, given that you built that, how do you keep excited? I mean, what's exciting coming up? What are you thinking about? What's going on?
Yeah. So at the moment, I'm super excited about.
You look it.
I do.
No, seriously, you look really excited. Yeah, no, you do. Yeah. I got the vibe when you walked in.
Yeah. Do you know why? Because I'm extracting myself from management. After 17 years, we've finally made some big hires. We've hired a CEO this year for the first time. We've hired a chief content officer for the first time.
Which is, they were your job roles, sort of.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Jason was CEO and I was chief content officer, essentially. And we've hired to replace ourselves, and we've sort of got this whole big management team now, senior leadership team. We've got a chief operating and product officer. We've got CFO. We've got all these people, head of content, and I'm climbing back down the ladder, and I'm back to making content. So I've got a audio documentary that I'm making. I'm still doing Mamamia Out Loud. I'm really excited because the running the business part, I'm very tired of. That's been 17 years of Mamamia, and before that, I was in management for another 15 years. And so that's a long time.
You were both a podcaster and in the business of podcasting.
Yeah, so I run I have three hats in the business. I'm a co-founder and co-owner. I am a manager, and I am talent. I'm a creative and a content creator, and that's what I want to be. I mean, of course, I'm a co-founder, and that stays, and a co-owner. But I want to be a creator. I want to get back to actually making stuff.
How important is it for someone like yourself? I mean, we're going to have to draw it to a close moment because our audiences don't last more than 45 minutes. Not because you, so it's me. I've trained them that way. But
45 minutes is quite a long time.
It is a long time. Yeah. How important is it to someone, and I've never experienced this, but how important is it to someone like you to be independently successful as a woman in the family, like your parents' family and your own sibling and yourself and your mum and dad? How important is it for you to be successful in your own right without any help from a super successful father?
Yeah, I'm really proud of that. I'm really proud of,
She didn't get a leg up, for example.
I'm so proud of my dad. And, let's be very clear about privilege and all of those things. I grew up, it's a huge privilege to even have that modeled in your family. And I also know that even though I didn't grow up hugely, we didn't grow up wealthy or anything. My father became very successful when I was a teenager, and there is a degree of mental safety of that can't be underscored, like the confidence of that. But Jace and I literally have built this from our lounge room together, and it has been the hardest thing we have ever done. It has nearly brought us to the brink of divorce. Lucky we got the divorce out of the way earlier and got back together. But it has been so tough. It is still so tough. Like, business is still so tough. Like, we're in a great place now, and the business is doing really, really well. But, no one saw COVID coming, and you never know. When you're a business owner, it never stops being stressful.
So I can ask you a question. Jerry Harvey once said to me on a golf course, I said, mate, why are you collecting all these crappy old golf balls you're finding on the side that other people have discarded and putting in a bag? And we were playing golf up in North New South Wales. And this is some years ago. And he said to me, and at that stage he would have been, a billionaire for sure at that stage. And he said to me, Mark, he said, I never think, or I continually think that one, I don't deserve it.
Mm-hmm.
And two, someone could take it away from me at any time.
Because they could.
And I think the same.
I think the same too.
And that drives you.
Of course, it does. No, you're 100% right. And sometimes people come into Mamamia, and we have a big office now down there. And if they don't own a business, they'll come in and they'll go, wow, it's so big. It's amazing. And if they do own a business or have owned a business, they'll walk in and they'll go, wow, it's so big. Because they see what we know, which is the cost of paying the salary of every person and every computer and the tea bags in the kitchen and the rent.
Yeah, the rent.
And they don't. If you're a business owner, you see the duck paddling underneath, right? Yeah. And you see the stress of it and the risk and the uncertainty and all of those things. And we've had to you just metabolize that. So I think most business owners don't spend a lot of time patting themselves on the back and going, gee, look at what we've achieved. Like I literally never, ever, ever do that. I always am like, what can we do better? What haven't we done well enough today? How can I make this better? What can we do next? I spend very little time going, I never, never.
Do you fear failure?
Constantly.
In whose eyes? My eyes, your eyes, your dad's eyes?
Well,
consumers' eyes.
Having been cancelled a few times, that always lives like a big, weight over me, the spectre of that, not just because of the personal damage that does to me mentally and everything, but the implications for the business. Like that's a lot of pressure to carry. But luckily the business exists kind of separate from me now, and I've been backing out the door for 17 years, has been always our mission is to make ourselves redundant within the business. And I think we're closer than ever to doing that. But I always feel failure. I'm madly competitive, hugely competitive.
But is that because you don't want to fail?
I don't want to fail.
Yeah.
Don't want to fail? Who wants to fail?
So the obsession is not to compete.
I fail all the time, to be clear. Like I fail and I fuck up and I get things wrong and I make mistakes like all the time. But I try. Like I'd prefer not to.
But you own the mistakes too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, my God, yes. I mean, I think our mistakes are the most interesting part of our stories. I don't think our successes are.
Yeah, totally. Well, for us it is.
I learn a lot more about myself about business from my failures.
We learn about ourselves.
Yeah.
But others sort of are very interested in our successes because, failure is a great driver to be successful. It's a great driver to be competitive. So in order not to fail, I have to compete. Some people,
yes.
Where do you think that comes from?
Well, women aren't really. Women have to talk a lot about our failures and our mistakes because women.
It's expected.
Yeah, because it's
by other women.
The world doesn't like a woman who is successful, and the world doesn't like that.
Do you think other women are like that too? Do you think other women also think, well, I don't like her because she's successful?
When a woman calls another woman ambitious, that's very coded.
For what?
For usually bad mother.
Bitch.
If someone goes, no, not it can be, but it often is. Oh, she's very ambitious. It just is. It's a real burn.
Yeah,
like it is.
That's mad. I never thought. Well, obviously, I don't live in that world,
it's
but
a burn.
That's mad. Yeah, I never thought about that.
And it shouldn't be.
Yeah, but what about when you describe yourself as very ambitious?
What's interesting, I say I call myself competitive. See, I've internalized that.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'm not going to say I'm ambitious because that doesn't feel like an okay thing for a woman to say. I say competitive. Because for somehow you're allowed to be competitive, but saying ambitious feels like you're a bit too full of yourself. I don't know. So I don't. Yeah, I think of myself as competitive.
Can you just take me quickly inside a woman's world, the women's world?
Let's go.
Because obviously I'm not in there. But take me inside for a second.
Okay.
The level of envy that exists in that world for someone who's more successful than them, or the level of competition. Maybe it's not necessarily. It's probably maybe I'm just speculating. It's less so after certain age groups, but more intense in a cohort. Maybe I may just make this up, 20 to 45. I mean, what's it like? Is it really competitive? Men Men aren't quite like that. We don't really give a damn.
I don't think that's
the
true.
Guys I know don't really give a damn about something else. Most of us are only interested in what we're doing. How good
I
we're
think
going.
the culture kind of has always said there's only room for one woman or a couple of women. And there's also that thing of generationally you have to overthrow the generation above you to take your place, right? It's like the lion will attack the headline of the pride. So that, and I've noticed that the people who have the hardest go at me are usually younger feminists who are wanting to come up and make their name. And
is that because they can take you out? They think they can take you out? To make their name, they've got to take you out?
Yeah, I think also I think it's also like I've got a daughter and I know that it's really important for people to define themselves in opposition to what's gone before them.
Which is what I said to you about your dad.
Yeah, which is interesting. I think father-daughter and mother-son relationships are a little bit different.
Yeah.
But I think that generations of women often in media will feel, and I know that I did it when I came out of magazines. I said awful things about magazines. I think I was really angry about I was angry at magazines, and which is a funny thing to say, but I was really horrible about magazines for a while because I guess I had to establish what I was doing in opposition to magazines. Like Mamamia is everything magazines aren't, in that we're not perfect. We're not about making women feel bad. We're not about being old fashioned and being stuck and being all photoshopped and all of those things. But now I'm very affectionate and Mamamia stands on the shoulders of women's magazines and those phenomenal editors, the actual women who ran them, who were absolute icons and who were not recognized for the incredible businesswomen that they were. Ita and Nini and Lisa and Deborah and all of those phenomenal women. Women's media and even those bloggers now and years ago we all stood on the shoulders of those giants.
Do you feel as though Mia Freedman is now in the same role as Deb and Lisa, and that you should, or you probably do it anyway? Do you do it? I should ask you. Encourage young women to come in if they write you a letter. Do encourage young women to come and do what you did with.
We employ
Lisa.
More than 100 of them, probably about 150 staff, probably 140 of them are young women. So yeah, that's what.
How do you feel about
that? Stoked.
Yeah,
I love it. I mean, I learned so much from them. They're delightful. Like, I'm a big fan of cross-generational friendships. Like, I've got great friends who are in their 20s, 30s, 60s, 70s, not just in my decade, in my 50s. And so, yeah, I love it. I think young women are phenomenal. I think they're so exciting and interesting and different to us.
And energetic.
And energetic, but they've got very good boundaries, Mark. They've got very good boundaries.
Yeah, the young kids, generally speaking, are like that in my organisation.
I've got my work and then I'm switching off my work and I have my right to disconnect and all of those things. And I think that's actually really healthy. After you get over the part where you go, oh, back in my day, I didn't, and that lane you go, oh my God, I sound like positively geriatric. And then you go, you know what, that's actually kind of cool. That's actually great.
Well, it also makes sense.
Yeah.
And before I go, I mean, can you throw that over here?
Sure.
I wanted to feel.
Toy.
I really wanted.
It's really good, isn't it?
Is this for ADHD?
Yeah.
And do you take it everywhere?
Everywhere. I drive with it. I hold it in my hand while I'm driving.
Well done. And it's interesting. Like I was wondering to myself, is this a little technique that helps you concentrate on the conversation?
Yeah.
Or
does.
Is it? I know you're very clever. And is this a process to sort of semi-distract me?
I didn't think about that. No, do you know why this one's really good is because usually I'm used to doing a podcast interview, either it'll be on Zoom or it'll be with the desk, right? So usually I do it under the desk so as not to distract anyone. And also because, I don't know, some people might find this embarrassing and silly. I always have little toys in meetings. But this is my special podcasting one because I've got a whole basket of fidgets on my desk and everywhere that I record. but I can't have noisy ones in podcasts.
No.
I am the absolute arch enemy of producers and sound engineers. So this one someone gave to me because it's silent and I love it.
I love it too. Can I just have
Yeah,
please.
because
I love it, and I'll just put it on the camera. What I love about this, because it wouldn't have picked you up because you're shot from the waist up. So why I wanted to
was it distracting for you?
No. I love these things as something, I don't know, in a physics sense and a chemistry sense. So quite fascinating about how this thing doesn't fall apart and doesn't squeeze out.
Yeah.
And it's a fascination to me.
It is. Yes, it is. And I can't explain why it helps me concentrate. And I've got various different ones, but otherwise I tend to pick my fingers. So this
you mean
is
pick
actually
the skin off your fingers?
Yeah, I'll pick the skin off my fingers because I won't even be aware I'm doing it. I just need something physical while we're talking. It just helps me concentrate.
Yeah, it's my mother was like that, and of course ADHD wasn't a diagnosed thing in those days, but she used to pick her fingers all the time, and I used to say, "Mum, what are you doing?" And her fingers would be bleeding; she wouldn't even know.
Same.
I'm sure she had ADHD, which is quite interesting, like in hindsight, because some of my kids have got it, some of my sons have got it.
And it's as genetically inheritable as height.
Totally, it's totally inheritable. And I probably have it or had it, but I don't know. But I also, I have other techniques to keep myself.
It's a very high incidence of ADHD in entrepreneurs, much higher than the general population, because entrepreneurs have a high appetite for risk.
Yeah.
And people with ADHD aren't able to metabolize consequences very well and risk.
Yeah.
And they've got a high appetite for risk. And that's why a lot of young men particularly are at risk of being injured or killed in accidents.
And also infidelity.
Yeah, interesting, because you can't think about the consequence.
Yep,
it's like this in this moment.
Yep.
Impulse control is really tricky.
I'm not trying to make an excuse for it, but it depends on the relationship anyway, but I'm not trying to make an excuse for it because there's all sorts of different types of relationships which tolerate, don't tolerate some of it, etc. But I do know, and I have read about this, but I read it in scientific magazines, but it is now correlated at least, whether it's causation, is correlated to infidelity in a lot of cases. I mean, I would say people like Trump probably has something going on there.
I think he's got
a whole lot of stuff.
He'd have a raft of
narcissism
issues.
and everything else.
Narcissism would be probably at the top of the leaderboard.
Yeah, and perhaps I wouldn't say psychopathic or in a pathological way, but perhaps a little bit of psychopathy.
There's a lot going on there.
Yeah.
Definitely, which is just great news for all of us for the next 4 years.
I'm not saying Kamala doesn't have it, because she may have well, I don't know her well enough. I do know him, and I have met him and talked to him and interviewed him and stuff like that, because we did during The Apprentice. But just my interaction with him, I could say that there is a bit of psychopathy there, because that's something I've studied, and there is a book out there on it's actually
David Gillespie's book.
Yes, and it gives you the 21 or 17. I can't remember what it is now.
He's phenomenal. Yeah, that was really. I interviewed him too. He's really interesting. They walk among us, psychopaths.
Well, someone told me they thought I was, and by the way, was a female. So she suggested I buy the book. So I thought I'd better go and buy the book as we were parting company.
Oh, I see. That's a great farewell gift.
Yeah, so I thought I'd better read it. Mia Freedman, thanks. This has been wonderful. Thanks for your honesty. I got so much out of it.
So did I.
Your
Thank
energy's
you.
unreal.
I just enjoyed the conversation so much.
Thanks, Mia.